All right, it's time for the last part of our China unit, part 3, Citizens, Society, and the State. And if you look at the comment there at the top, it's all about not challenging the state and the party. All right, as we talked in the beginning, the majority of the population, 90% of the population, is Han Chinese. Minority groups, minority ethnic groups represent about 8% of the population, only about 100 million citizens. There are 55 officially recognized minority groups. Most of them live around the fringes. So they're on or near the borders with other countries. And if you can imagine that, there might be some ethnicities that cross the borders as well. And certainly in China, that has caused some challenges and some problems. Most of these live in the autonomous regions. So the 5 autonomous regions: Guangxi, Inner Mongolia, Nangxia, Tibet, and Xinjiang. None of these minority groups is relative to the rest of the population very large, and most of the areas around the borders on the edges are pretty sparsely populated, but they do make up about 60% of the total land area of China. Another factor to consider, some of these autonomous regions are very rich in resources. Chinese approach to minority groups is to, obviously because of the resources, encourage economic development and certainly to suppress dissent. They're greatly concerned in the minority ethnic population about separatist movements. Because these dissidents are a long way from dense populated areas in the east and in the south, China's worried that they might stir things up and encourage independence or join with maybe some ethnic neighbors in neighboring countries and seek independence. But these regions they're called semi-autonomous regions, they do have some autonomy, primarily in cultural matters. The limited use of minority languages in media and literature, bilingual education, minority religions, though they have to be through state-approved organizations. And we do occasionally see some suppression of the minority languages, and we'll talk a little bit about the fact that Mandarin is the mandated language as well. Some of the specific groups, there are the Tibetans, under Chinese military occupation since the 1950s. The former government of Tibet never recognized the claimed Chinese authority. Tibetans practice a unique form of Buddhism. They're very fiercely loyal to the Dalai Lama, the priest believed to be the incarnation of the divine being. In 1959, the Dalai Lama was forced into exile in India following a failed political rebellion by his followers. And Mao worked very hard to suppress the Tibetan culture. Since the late 1970s, Buddhist temples and monasteries have been allowed to reopen. They've been given more cultural freedom, but there have been at different times, and we'll talk about some of these times when Chinese troops have come in and crushed several anti-China demonstrations. Tensions exploded in 2008 in the run-up to the 2008 Olympics in Beijing. Again, the Communist Party was looking to have, smooth things over and not have protests and the like for the Olympic Games, so they tried to suppress any tensions, and these tensions kind of blew up in 2008. There were clashes between anti-Chinese protesters in this region and security forces that began in Tibet's capital of Lhasa, and they spread to other Tibetan communities elsewhere in China. Different reporting in terms of how significant or how widespread the violence was. Beijing said that 19 people were killed in the rioting, while Tibetan exile groups say that nearly 100 people were killed by security forces. Another significant group to mention are the Uyghurs, and we've talked about the Uyghurs a little bit in class. The Uyghurs are Muslims of Turkish descent, and they share ethnicities with people right across the border. They live primarily in the Xinjiang province. There are militants among the Uyghurs that would like to have a separate Islamic-dominated state. Their language is related to Turkish. They regard themselves as more culturally and ethnically closer to Central Asia than they do the rest of China. In recent decades, China has encouraged the migration of a significant number of Han Chinese into the region, and many Uyghurs complain about discrimination as a result of that. Currently, the Han Chinese population in Xinjiang represent about 40% of the population, while about 45% are Uyghurs. There's been violence at different times. In 2010, there were riots and fighting between the Uyghurs and the Han. About 150 deaths, 1,000 injuries, 1,500 people arrested. Almost all of those arrested were Uyghurs. 12 were sentenced to death. And as we've talked about in class, there are many, up to a million or more Uyghurs who have been forced into re-education camps or concentration camps or vocational camps, depending on who you talk to, where they've basically been re-educated and they've been declined the opportunity to practice their Islamic faith, been forced to use Mandarin, and just kind of trying to wipe out the cultural uniqueness of the Uyghurs. There's an article there that talks a little bit more about some of the cleavages or the ethnic cleavages in China. In terms of language, for most of China, there's been a shared written language for centuries. Since its inception, the communist regime has tried to force Mandarin as the official language of the government and education, and they've forced that language not just in the densely populated East, but also in those semi-autonomous regions where the ethnic minorities are represented as well. In 2006, China stepped up its repression of the Cantonese language, which is in the southern part, exists mainly in the southern part of China, a language which in various forms and dialects is native to about 100 million people, so it's not all that significant in the bigger picture, but at different times the Chinese government, the Communist Party, has tried to push or repress the use of Cantonese. Rules require that most people in the public sector, teachers, broadcast media, and the like, use Mandarin, the official language. We see other cleavages between the urban population and the rural population. So the economic growth that has happened since 1979 and Deng Xiaoping has led to really the growth of two Chinas. And there's a good TED Talk out there that talks about the two Chinas that I would have liked to have had time for us to watch. The reforms, the economic reforms, the industrialization have led to massive development efforts, certainly in the urban areas. And recently, as we have seen throughout history, when there's industrialization, when economies open up, a middle class emerges. And we've seen significant growth in the Chinese middle class. The urban population in 2019 is all the way up to 60.3% of the population, and that urban population has a higher income, has a higher level of education, is representative of a higher social class. 2011 is the first time when the population in the urban centers was greater than that in the rural. So it went over the 50% mark, or the 50% mark in 2011. In my notes here, I've got China's urban population surpassed that of rural areas for the first time in the country's history after 3 decades of economic development encouraged farmers to seek better living standards in the city. So there was an economic motivation for farmers and the poor peasants in the countryside to move to the towns and move to the cities. With this urban migration, and this now 60% of the population in the urban centers, there's been an increasing inequality. The rural peasants often live without some basic infrastructure that we're used to in the West, certainly electricity, plumbing, paved roads, access to the internet, or even access to phones. So significant inequality between the urban and the rural populations. Got a lot of facts here, and I'm just going to kind of go through those listed, and there are some other ones in the notes that you're welcome to go through. China had 172 urban residents in 1978, so rather small part of the portion of the population, but when Deng Xiaoping came into power. By 2006, this number had mushroomed, and as we remember from the previous slide, it was 2011 when it went over 50%. Between 1990 and 2005, about 103 million Chinese moved from the countryside to the cities, so significant migration to the cities. And again, these are going to be the cities in the east and in the south of the country. By 2015, the urban population, it has exceeded 700 million. 2010, the rural per capita net income, $758 a year, was less than a third of what was made by the urban dwellers. So it's the worst showing since China's market reforms in 1978. So it highlights that inequality between the cities and the countryside. Nearly 500 million Chinese live on less than $2 a day. 85% of the poor in China live in rural areas, about 66% in the western part of the country. So again, in those semi-autonomous regions, very sparsely populated, but also not much economic opportunity. Just under half lives in rural areas, but they share less than 12% of the country's wealth. Poverty among ethnic minorities is 2 to 3 times higher than among the Han Chinese. Again, so you've got that ethnic split between the Han majority, 90%, and the ethnic minorities, but you've also got the significant cleavage between the urban and the rural population. A lot of overlap in those two categories. About 145 million migrant workers, about 11% of the population. Larger, if you think about it, comparing it to the U.S., larger than the entire workforce in the United States. So different levels when we're talking about population in China. All right, political participation. In an authoritarian system, there are different forms of political participation, not all of them present at any given time, but we do see joining political parties as a way to participate in the political process, standing for office, voting, and as we'll see in China, there is voting, but it's going to happen at the very local level. Protests and demonstrations. Yes, we see protests and demonstrations even in authoritarian China. Occasionally we see civil disobedience, and we've seen that in China as well. There are occasions in authoritarian regimes, not often, but where you have a coup, where you have a revolution, and certainly when you have political violence, and you saw that in Tiananmen Square this week. Another way to participate in the political process is to join an interest group, a non-governmental organization, or citizens' policy meetings. When you think back to the idea of the mass line, this communication from the lower threshold or the lower categories of the social ladder to the leadership. So many ways to participate. In terms of political parties, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. Again, you'll also see it sometimes as the CPC. That is basically the same organization. So the CCP in participation, it's the largest political party in the world. In 2001, capitalists were allowed to come and join the party. So that is the main party. There's also a youth league that is associated with that, more than 75 million members in the youth league. And the Chinese Communist Party also allows the existence of 8 other, and it's in quotes, democratic parties. Okay, so these are in title at least called parties, but they don't have much impact. They don't have much authority. So each party has a special group that it draws, whether it's intellectuals or other groups, anything that these democratic parties do is very tightly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. They don't have any power. They're just in advisory roles. In the notes there, I list the 8 parties of the United Front, or the Democratic parties. Let's see. None of these entities has any real power apart from the Communist Party of China, although many that are members of those 8 democratic parties are also members of the CCP. Each party is associated with a certain interest. So, for example, the Juisan Society tends to focus on scientific development. The China Democratic Lead focuses on modernization and democracy. So again, they're advisory parties for the most part, and they're very tightly controlled by the dominant Chinese Communist Party. Elections in China, and yes, China has elections, and we saw that in our video, I believe, last week that we watched, at least at the local level. So they do hold local elections, and if you think about it, this is one of the ways that the Chinese Communist Party legitimizes its government and legitimizes its own existence. The party controls any elections that happen. The party approves the list of candidates, and the only level where you have direct elections are at the very local level, so in the village, in the province. The voters choose the deputies to serve on the County People's Congress. Since the 1980s, the Chinese Communist Party has allowed more than one candidate to run for county positions. So again, elections are going to be only at the local level. There has been whatever small movements toward democracy has been at the very local level. No longer are the local officials appointed from above, but they're chosen in direct secret ballot elections. And as we saw in the video, it is very important, and there's high levels of participation in these elections. Interest groups. As we've said several other times, so much of society is controlled by the state, is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So interest groups as well, any social movements are not allowed unless they have permission to exist, to operate under party and state authority. State corporatism, so very similar in China as things are in Russia. So you have to have approval from the state in order to exist. And if you push things too hard, if you go against the interests of the party, you're going to be shut down. The party state forms mass organizations, and the definition for mass organizations: organizations in a Communist Party state that represent the interest of a particular social group, such as workers or women, but which are controlled by the CCP. So within these interest groups or these mass organizations, it's a women's group, or it's a men's group, or it's a certain interest or environment or something like that. People are allowed to certainly express their views, but there are strict limits or boundaries within which they're allowed to exercise those views or express those views. Oftentimes, these interest groups, these organizations are formed around occupations or social categories. So, for example, factory workers belong to an All China Federation of Trade Unions. Women's interests in China represented by the All China Women's Federation. All right, and in urban areas, social control is exercised primarily through the work unit. In China, it's called the Danwei. The Danwei is responsible for giving people jobs, providing for their income, any promotions they get in the workplace, medical care, housing, daycare centers, and recreational facilities. So the Danwei, or the work unit, has been critical in urban areas, definitely since Deng Xiaoping in 1979. But in really the second half of the 20th century as well. Political participation, still talking about civil society. Basically, civil society under Mao and his control basically did not exist. But we've seen in recent years the increase in the number of private organizations. These organizations tend to focus on social issues and generally don't present a challenge or challenge. They don't push the authority of the state. Historically, because these organizations exist only at the pleasure, only with the approval of the state, civil society by necessity has been pretty disorganized. They're all very rather tentative in terms of what they do and how they express and take action on their interests. As China has liberalized economically, we have seen both in the number and really in the focus of some of these private organizations gaining more power as an independent force. Not necessarily anything that's challenging the state, but certainly in certain areas they've gained a greater voice. Since 2005, the number of non-governmental organizations, so NGOs, has doubled. China has thousands of these organizations ranging from ping pong clubs to environmentalist groups, NGOs, organizations that deal with religion. So Christianity and Buddhism are seeing something of a rebound. And again, they can only rebound so far as they're not threatening the state. And occasionally you will see the state come down on these religious groups. The government keeps a close eye on all its population, but definitely on these groups, again, making sure that they're not going to pose a threat. These organizations have to register with the government, but they generally have some latitude to operate without direct party interference if, and there's a capital IF, if they steer clear of politics and they don't challenge official state policies. So again, some free range, some autonomy to do what they want, but the moment they start to become a threat, they're going to be dealt with. We do see protests in China, and we've seen more protests or mass group incidents in the last few decades. Most demonstrations are not a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. Most deal with corruption in the government or environmental issues. And we increasingly see environmental issues as China has industrialized, and certainly the Chinese are dealing with significant pollution as well. There are times when the CCP will give in or respond to the actions and the protests of a party. Again, this is to stop them from complaining and to some level gives them the perception that they're listening to the people. So they'll pick their moments and occasionally respond to protests. When a group or a party represents a broader threat to their rule, the responses are much more serious. The responses can range from arrest, suppression, censorship of the message, throwing the people in jail, or to re-education camps, which we've seen several groups deal with. There haven't been as many mass group incidents since Tiananmen Square, and again, that's something that you watch this week. We have occasionally seen the state come down hard on the religious group Falun Gong, both critical of exiles, but also Falun Gong practitioners within China, and that's a religious group. Occasionally labor unrest is also dealt with pretty heavily, but that's primarily at the village or the local level. We do see, and we mentioned it earlier, some protests in the autonomous regions in Tibet. There were protests in the capital Lhasa in March 2008 on the 49th anniversary of the failed uprising against China in 1959, and that continued with the approach of the 2008 Olympics. Also in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, we had riots in 2009, 2010, with expressing dissatisfaction with how the Chinese government handled the death of 2 Uyghur workers during previous disruptions. So we do see them occasionally, more often in the autonomous border regions, but they're usually dealt with pretty significantly. The media in China. Until 1980, all the media was owned and controlled by the state. It was the mouthpiece for the state. Any messages had to be approved by the CCP. With economic liberalization, we now have a mix of state-owned and privately owned media that has emerged. Now, though the message still continues to be very friendly to the CCP, and there certainly is a belief that the state, even though it is privately owned, the state still has significant control over the message and the voice in the media. You will see some criticism on websites, microblogs, and social media. It's difficult and challenging for them to censor, to squelch all messages, but they certainly do their best to do that. We do have some very limited independent media, and even as we've seen with the coronavirus and some of the early reporters who investigated and spread the news about the virus, some question as to how they've been dealt with. But most of the independent media today deals with investigative reporting. So limited in scope, rooting out corruption, and again, it doesn't always make it to the surface, so to speak. The official state press agency is Xinhua. And again, all press is subject to heavy censorship by the state. As we've discussed a little bit, and as you saw it relative to Tiananmen Square, the internet is very strictly controlled. So if you're searching for content on Google or the other search engines within China, you're not going to get information on the Tiananmen Square massacre. You're not going to get information on subjects that go against the interest of the Chinese Communist Party. Sometimes it's called the Great Firewall of China. Many that are tech savvy are able to use different solutions, virtual private networks and the like, to get around some of the filters. So it's not as if they're able to keep out all critical messages, but for most of the population, it is fairly tightly controlled. But certainly the opposition is able to, if they want to, get around those filters. If a journalist goes too far and they're critical of the party, they would often find themselves with a fine or thrown in prison, and that happens fairly aggressively. All right, just as a wrap up here, I'd like you to think about this. So if I'm going to read this, and then if you could just pause and think about how you might do this. So imagine that they're forming an activist group to protest the government. How would they communicate to possible members, possible participants, and plan to meet? How would they find the information that they need? How would they connect with others who are interested in joining the cause? So think about that in an authoritarian state like China is, with all those limitations and increasingly the surveillance of the state. How would you do that? And next, imagine the government's using its power to limit activists' ability to use social media tools. What then? What ideas do you have for getting around those restrictions or for organizing a group or a protest without them? How much would these restrictions hamper your ability to organize? So think about how the Tiananmen Square protesters got the word out. Certainly we didn't have social media then. So how might in 2020 you organize such an effort? Something to think about.